using and abusing all the life on the earth because nothing ever show of any value.
Black is it's a glue. Black is that holds it all together. Black is me.
You could feel it before you heard it. Saturday afternoon, somebody's living room, the curtains half drawn against the August heat, your father's record player sitting on its little shelf like it owned the room. He pulled the sleeve out slow, slid the vinyl free without touching the grooves, set the needle down the way a surgeon sets a scalpel. And then that first crack of a conga drum, that voice speaking in complete sentences over a rhythm that refused to hurry. It wasn't singing. It wasn't a sermon. It was something nobody had ever named yet. You sat on the floor with your knees pulled up and you listened, and you didn't know enough to call it rap, but something inside you recognized it as yours. The word that kept forming behind your eyes was truth. This was somebody telling the truth over music. And once you heard it, nothing sounded the same again. America in the 1970s was not a gentle place for black men. The Civil Rights Acts were signed, but the streets hadn't read them. The South Bronx was literally on fire. 120,000 fires a year, one every 2 hours. Landlords torching their own buildings for insurance money, while 60,000 residents scattered like sparks. Vietnam was swallowing a generation whole. Black unemployment ran at twice the white rate every single year of that decade. And the music being made in direct response to all of it, was doing something that had never quite been done before. We're exploring 20 artists whose voices carved a generation's identity into wax before hip-hop ever had a name, tracing the full lineage from spoken word prophets to Bronx block parties. Let's start with the group that made the whole world feel like a revolution was already overdue.
Song and dance and making you laugh are family members.
The Last Poets walked out of a park in Harlem on May 19th, 1968, and nothing was ever the same. That date was Malcolm X's birthday, and the three men who stood up and recited poems that afternoon, David Nelson, Wogillan Kane, and Abiodun Oyewole, named themselves after a South African poem declaring that this would be the last age of poetry before guns took over. 2 years later, their 1970 self-titled debut on Douglas Records reached number 29 on the Billboard chart without a single second of radio play, selling over 300,000 copies on word of mouth alone. That record was recorded essentially in one take. The sound of congas, open palms slapping stretched skin, and voices that did not ask permission. Critics called it inflammatory. The FBI opened a file on them. Miles Davis said he used to love the Last Poets. Quincy Jones called what they were doing, this mix of elements, what people now label rap, the first time he'd ever encountered it. That vinyl LP cost you $5.98 off the shelf in 1970, about $35 in today's money. And what you got for that was the most honest document of Black America that had ever been pressed into plastic. This wasn't just poetry. It was a testimony. It was the sound of a people deciding they were done whispering. And if the Last Poets were the lit fuse, then Gil Scott-Heron was the philosopher who explained why the building needed to burn. Born April 1st, 1949 in Chicago, raised by his grandmother in Jackson, Tennessee, and eventually landing in the Bronx, where he attended DeWitt Clinton High School before earning a scholarship to the Fieldston School and then an MA in creative writing from Johns Hopkins. Scott-Heron carried an education in his voice that never made him sound educated in the cold, lifeless way. He released his debut album, Small Talk, at 125th and Linux on Flying Dutchman Records in 1970, a spare spoken word record with conga accompaniment recorded before a small audience seated on folding chairs. The Revolution Will Not Be Televised was on that album, and its 1971 re-recording on Pieces of a Man added Ron Carter on bass, Bernard Purdie on drums, and Hubert Laws on flute, rapping political prophecy in the most gorgeous jazz soul arrangement you'd ever heard. Over the decade, he released 9 albums, including Winter in America on the independent Strata East label in 1974, The First Minute of a New Day on Arista in 1975, and Secrets in 1978. Chuck D, a Public Enemy, said Scott Heron's music was a kind of CNN for black neighborhoods, prefiguring hip-hop by several years. He called himself a bluesologist. He rejected the title Godfather of Rap. But what he gave you was a map, a way to understand why the world felt the way it felt, delivered in a voice that sat right between singing and talking, flowing over the rhythm with the unhurried confidence of a man who already knew how the story ended. And then there was the record that took that flowing voice and aimed it straight at the streets. In 1973, a man named Jalal Mansour Nuruddin, born Lawrence Padilla in 1944 in the Fort Greene projects of Brooklyn, released Hustler's Convention on United Artists under the name Lightnin' Rod. It was a full concept album, a narrative about two hustlers named Sport and Spoon navigating the ghetto through gambling, drugs, and a shootout that ends in prison enlightenment, backed by Cool and the Gang and Billy Preston. Ice-T would later call it the first gangsta rap album and say he could recite every word from memory. Chuck D called it a verbal Bible for understanding the streets. Fab Five, Freddie named it a cornerstone in the development of what is now global culture. Wu-Tang Clan, the Beastie Boys, and the Red Hot Chili Peppers all sampled it. Nuruddin, who had been a founding member of the Last Poets and who had recorded Doriella DuFontaine with Jimi Hendrix and Buddy Miles in 1969, died in June 2018 and was called the grandfather of rap by the Recording Academy. He proved that a complete story, an entire movie, could be told with nothing but rhyme, rhythm, and the right bass line underneath.
To knock the line in the average bitch's cock.
And his name was Rudy Ray Moore. Born March 17, 1927 in Fort Smith, Arkansas, Moore was working at Dolphins of Hollywood Record Store around 1970 when he heard a street man recite a ribald, rhyming tale about a character called Dolomite, a toast, which is what Black oral tradition calls those ancient rhyming narratives that had been passed from man to man on porches, barbershop floors, and in prison yards for generations. Moore adopted the character. You'll recorded Eat Out. More often, and This Pussy Belongs to Me on his own Kent Records label, sold those records out of the trunk of his car and under record store counters because they were too explicit for display, and built a legend entirely on word of mouth at a time when a single album cost around $4 in discount bins. Snoop Dogg set it straight. Without Rudy Ray Moore, there is no Snoop Dogg. Dr. Dre, Eazy-E, Eric B. and Rakim, Big Daddy Kane, Wu-Tang Clan, Busta Rhymes, they all sampled him. His signature boast, his larger-than-life persona, his willingness to say things on record that radio would never touch. That was the blueprint for every rapper who ever walked to the microphone to brag. This wasn't just comedy. It was the oral tradition of Africa and the Middle Passage and the American street encoded in rhyme and pressed into vinyl for 79 cents a pop. Now, if Rudy Ray Moore gave hip-hop its swagger, then the man who gave it its heartbeat was born James Joseph Brown Jr.
This is a man's world.
May 3rd, 1933, in Barnwell, South Carolina, raised in Augusta, Georgia, in poverty so complete he sometimes went to school in clothes made from potato sacks. By the 1970s, he was releasing records on Polydor at a pace that seemed humanly impossible. Sex Machine in 1970, Superbad in 1970, Hot Pants in 1971, The Payback in 1973, Hell in 1974, and doing it all while maintaining a touring review of 40 to 50 people performing 5 and 6 nights a week. But the record that changed the architecture of all music was a single from 1970 called Funky Drummer, built around a drum break that his drummer Clyde Stubblefield had improvised during a 1969 session. That break, that specific 12-bar pattern of kick drum, snare, and open hi-hat, has been sampled over 1,500 times. Public Enemy built an entire album around it. Orkern NWA built a movement on top of it. LL Cool J put it under Mama Said Knock You Out. When DJ Kool Herc set up his turntables at 1520 Sedgwick Avenue in the Bronx on August 11th, 1973, it was James Brown records he was isolating, extending, and looping for the dancers. Brown was not one of 20 influences on hip-hop. He was its circulatory system. His philosophy that rhythm was the primary element, above melody, above everything, became hip-hop's founding law. And it was that same law that Curtis Mayfield bent toward consciousness in 1972 when he delivered the Superfly soundtrack on his own Curtom Records label and proved that a black man could own his art, control his narrative, and outsell the film it was made for.
Add a little sugar.
Born June 3rd, 1942, in Chicago, Mayfield had already built his reputation with the Impressions, but Superfly was different. It hit number 1 on the Billboard album chart for 4 weeks and sold over 12 million copies. Pusherman and Freddie's Dead went gold. His falsetto voice and distinctive open guitar tuning, tuned to the black keys of the piano, created a sound that was simultaneously gorgeous and heartbroken. Mayfield made it possible for a rap record to be beautiful and devastating at the same time. The Library of Congress added the Superfly soundtrack to the National Recording Registry in 2018. They heard the same thing you heard. I was sitting on that floor in 1972, a man using music to hold a mirror up to the ugliest part of the neighborhood and refusing to look away. From there, the wax got even denser and richer with meaning. Isaac Hayes, born August 20th, 1942, in Covington, Tennessee, that had already won the Academy Award for Best Original Song for Theme from Shaft at the 1972 ceremony, the first Oscar ever won by a black musician outside of acting, and his Black Moses album on Stax's Enterprise label introduced something nobody had heard before, an extended spoken word monologue, sometimes 8 or 10 or 19 minutes long, laid over slow, rolling orchestration. His Ike's Rap series was literally proto-rap. He called it progressive soul. His shaved head, gold chains, and dark sunglasses became the visual template that hip-hop would borrow wholesale 20 years later. What Hayes gave black men in the 1970s was permission to be thoughtful and cinematic and unhurried on a record. And if that sounds like something you'd call grown man rap today, that's because it is. Marvin Gaye had already done something equally seismic the year before. What's Going On, released in 1971 on Motown's Tamla imprint, was the first Motown concept album. Berry Gordy initially refused to release it, reportedly calling it the worst record he'd ever heard. It sold 100,000 copies on its first day. Gaye's technique of layering his own voice 3 and 4 times deep created a sound of communal grief. A man arguing with himself about Vietnam, police brutality, poverty, and environmental destruction. The album's seamless flow from song to song, its refusal to separate social reality from emotional intimacy, became the template for every conscious rap album that followed. And right alongside it was Stevie Wonder, who at 21 renegotiated his Motown contract for full artistic control and then proceeded to release Talking Book, Inner Visions, Fulfillingness First Finale, and Songs in the Key of Life in a span of 4 years, winning Grammy Album of the Year 3 consecutive times, a feat no solo artist has ever matched. Pastime Paradise from Songs in the Key of Life would become Coolio's Gangsta's Paradise 2 decades later. Wonder's mastery of synthesizer technology, his refusal to be confined by genre, his marriage of the personal and the political, these became cornerstones of what hip-hop aspired to be at its most ambitious. And yet, not all the music that shaped that generation was trying to change the world. Some of it was just trying to hold a relationship together after a 12-hour shift. Barry White, Born Barry Eugene Carter on September 12, 1944, in Galveston, Texas, and raised in South Los Angeles, had the deepest bass baritone voice in the history of recorded music, and he wrapped it in 40-piece string arrangements that 20th Century Records put into heavy rotation on WBLS beginning in 1973. I'm Gonna Love You, Just a Little More Baby hit #1 R&B that year. Can't Get Enough of Your Love, Babe hit #1 pop in 1974. His Love Unlimited Orchestra's Love's Theme became one of the first disco-era instrumental #1s. White sold over 100 million records worldwide. His music was the sound of a Saturday night when everything went right, played low on a component stereo system while the chicken was still in the oven and the children were already in bed. This wasn't about revolution. It was about dignity, about the right to have a soft, private, unhurried moment inside a decade that never stopped being loud. Bobby Womack understood both worlds. Born March 4, 1944, in Cleveland, discovered by Sam Cooke as a child gospel singer, Womack's voice carried the blues and the church and the street all at once. And in 1972, Chisholm has Across 110th Street, the title track from the blaxploitation film of the same name, released on United Artists, delivered a portrait of urban poverty and desperation that cut like broken glass. When Quentin Tarantino opened Jackie Brown with that song in 1997, an entirely new generation heard what black men had known since 1972. Some streets don't ask how you ended up there. Sly Stone had articulated the same darkness from inside what used to be a party. There's a Riot Going On, released on Epic Records in November 1971, topped both the pop and soul album charts and introduced a murky, fragmented funk that sounded like a man recording alone in the dark, because largely it was. Sly played most instruments himself, and one of the first drum machines ever used on a commercial record, the Maestro Rhythm King MRK2, kept time on tracks where Flesh and Blood players used to be. Family Affair hit #1 pop. The utopia was over. What replaced it was honest. George Clinton and the Parliament Funkadelic universe offered a different kind of exit from that darkness, not forward into realism, but upward into pure mythology. Born July 22, 1941, in Kannapolis, North Carolina, Clinton ran two parallel groups on different labels, Funkadelic on Westbound and Warner Brothers, with Eddie Hazel's Hendrix-influenced guitar and albums like Maggot Brain in 1971, and One Nation Under a Groove in 1978, and Parliament on Casablanca, with horn-driven cosmic funk, and albums like Mothership Connection in 1975, and Funkadelic versus the Placebo Syndrome in 1977. Clinton created an entire Afrofuturist mythology, a spaceship, a star child, a villain called Sir Nose Devoid of Funk, and brought that spaceship down from the ceiling of actual arenas on actual cables during live shows. Flashlight in 1978 hit #1 R&B. Bernie Worrell's Moog synthesizer bass and Bootsy Collins' space bass became the sonic foundation that Dr. Dre would build the entire G-Funk sound on top of a decade and a half later. If James Brown gave hip-hop its drum, Parliament Funkadelic gave it its soul. But the next place you need to go is not a recording studio. It's a recreation room in a high-rise apartment building at 1520 Sedgwick Avenue in the South Bronx. On August 11, 1973, a young man named Clive Campbell, born April 16, 1955, in Kingston, Jamaica, and raised in the Bronx since age 12, set up his father's sound system in that rec room for a back-to-school party his sister Cindy had organized. Admission was 25 cents for girls, 50 cents for boys. Sodas were 50 cents. Beer was $1. He had two turntables, a GLI mixer, a 300-watt Macintosh amplifier, and a deep crate of vinyl. He had two copies of James Brown's Give It Up or Turn It A Loose, and instead of playing a song from start to finish, the way every DJ before him had done, he isolated the percussion break, the section where the band dropped out and the drums took over, and when that break ended on one turntable, he was already cueing it back to the start on the other. He called it the merry-go-round technique. The dancers went wild. They called them break boys and break girls, B-boys and B-girls. You knew him as DJ Kool Herc. Congress would officially designate August 11th as Hip Hop Celebration Day in 2021. That night in 1973, he was 18 years old, and he had just invented the foundation of the most influential art form of the next 50 years. Herc needed a voice, and that voice belonged to a young man from the east side of the Bronx named Coke LaRock, born April 24th, 1955, hip-hop's first MC, who stood at the mic and improvised shout-outs, jokes, and crowd calls over the breaks Herc was looping. The phrase, "You rock and you don't stop," came from his mouth at those early jams. He never recorded a single note during those years. His entire legacy lived in the memories of everyone who was there. For DJ Red Alert, later called Herc and Coke like Batman and Robin, and out of their tradition grew Africa Bambaataa, born Lance Taylor on April 17, 1957, and raised in the Bronx River Houses, a former warlord of the Black Spades Gang who renamed himself after a Zulu chief after visiting Africa, and who, on November 12, 1977, founded the Universal Zulu Nation with the mission, Peace, Love, Unity, Having Fun. Bambaataa turned gang members into DJs and B-boys. He played anything with a usable break: funk, rock, disco, electronic, world music. Cornell University acquired his collection of over 30,000 records in 2013. He defined hip-hop's 4 elements: DJing, emceeing, breaking, and graffiti. The culture had a name now, and it had a scientist, Grandmaster Flash, born Joseph Robert Sadler on January 1st, 1958, in Bridgetown, Barbados, raised in the Bronx. I was trained in electronics at Samuel Gompers Vocational High School, transformed DJing from Herc's intuitive art into precision engineering. He invented backspin, punch phrasing, the slip mat, the crossfader monitor system. He marked break sections on records with crayon so he could see the cue point at a glance. He built a switch out of components he glued to a mic mixer to create the first true headphone monitoring system. His Furious 5 gave those techniques a voice, and lead MC Mele Mel, born Melvin Glover on May 15, 1961, in the Bronx, may have been the first MC to call himself MC. The group released Super Rappin' on Enjoy Records in 1979, selling over 100,000 copies before they signed to Sugar Hill Records, where they would later make The Message in 1982, the first hip-hop record added to the U.S. National Archive of Historic Recordings, the record that proved rap could carry the full weight of black suffering and make it undeniable. The Sugar Hill Gang got there first, though. On September 16, 1979, Rapper's Delight hit the world on Sugar Hill Records, catalog number SHL-101. Wonder Mike, Master G, and Big Bank Hank, none of them seasoned rappers, recorded it in a single take over a live band, recreating Chic's Good Times bass line. The 12-inch ran nearly 15 minutes. It reached number 36 on the Billboard Hot 100, number 4 on the Soul Chart, number 1 in Canada and the Netherlands, and sold, at its peak, up to 96,000 copies a day. First rap single in the top 40, over 2 million copies sold in the U.S. alone. When it played on WBLS, fathers who had never stood in front of a turntable heard what their sons had been doing in parks and rec rooms and realized it had become something too big to ignore. And finally, Curtis Blow, born Kurt Walker on August 9, 1959, in Harlem, managed by a young Russell Simmons, released Christmas Rappin' on Mercury Records in 1979. The first rap single released on a major label, which sold over 400,000 copies. His 1980 follow-up, The Breaks, sold over 500,000 copies and became the first rap record certified gold by the RIAA. He was 20 years old. Run of Run DMC called himself the son of Curtis Blow. And that's how it happened. Not all at once. Not with a single inventor. It happened over a decade in living rooms and rec centers and on block party sidewalks where people ran extension cords out of first-floor apartment windows, where the bass from a 300-watt amplifier made your ribcage vibrate from 40 feet away, where a vinyl record that cost you $5.98 contained more truth about your life than anything the evening news had ever told you. These 20 artists, the spoken word prophets, the funk architects, the Bronx innovators, weren't competing. They were collaborating across time, each one handing something forward to the next, each one adding a layer to a sound that was being built specifically to survive the kind of decade America gave black men in the 1970s. Thanks for riding with us on this one. This is the kind of history that deserves to be remembered in full. Which of these artists hit you hardest? Drop their name in the comments. If this video gave you something real, so give it a like and share it with someone who remembers what that Saturday afternoon felt like. And if you haven't subscribed yet, we do this every week. The deep cuts, the full story, the music that built everything you love. Don't miss it.